Princess Anya traced a finger along the faded runes etched upon the crumbling stone. The air in the royal library's hidden chamber hummed with ancient power, sending a shiver of unease down her spine. Most dismissed her obsession with the past as folly, the ramblings of a bookish princess ill-fit for the intrigues of court, yet here in the dust and encroaching shadows the whispers of history clawed at her, demanding to be heard. "Elderon," she breathed, the syllables heavy with a terror her people had long forgotten. "The tyrant king, a blight upon the world." The tales were mere children's stories now, the all-consuming wars that birthed their prosperous kingdom, just myths. She'd been mocked, her painstaking translations of decaying texts dismissed as flights of fancy. Yet amongst the scattered fragments of the past, she'd found a desperate truth hidden in coded verse and fading constellations scribed onto crumbling tablets. The warnings had been clear. Elderon was not dead, merely caged. Those ancient wards, woven by the combined might of elven mages, dwarven smiths, and the blood of heroes, were weakening. Anya's hand tightened upon the leather-bound journal clutched to her chest. Her brother, Prince Keldrin, future king, laughed and trained with blades, oblivious to the creeping darkness she felt, coiling within the world itself. The royal council humoured her with an indulgence reserved for harmless eccentricities. No one took the forgotten princess seriously. No one except Rylan, captain of the royal guard. He wasn't family, yet their shared childhood forged a bond Anya clung to as a lifeline. More than her brother's bluster or the council's tired smiles, his steady presence and unwavering faith in her work grounded her when doubts began to gnaw. They'd spent whispered hours over her translations, his scepticism slowly eroding into grim acceptance. He, more than anyone, understood her desperation to act before those whispers of doom became deafening. "Princess." Rylan's voice cut through the library's ancient silence, heavy with unspoken urgency. "I bring news. There's been an incident along the northern border." Anya's stomach clenched. "The shadow beasts." Her name for the nightmares plaguing frontier villages, creatures of pure darkness, unnatural and ravenous. Each isolated report dismissed as wild animal attacks, but in her fevered mind she saw a far more terrifying pattern. Each sighting was a tremor before the earthquake. "Worse," Rylan said, his knuckles white where they gripped his sword hilt. "A scouting party found a hamlet on the edge of Elderon territory, razed, every soul slaughtered. There were—" He hesitated, a flicker of something she couldn't name passing over his usually stoic features. The marks were not of any animal nor of any known weapon. The shadows themselves seemed to have torn those villagers to ribbons. They'd spoken of this possibility fearfully in stolen moments. Anya's heart thudded against her ribs, each beat echoing the fading cries of the doomed village. How far from the elven border? Close, too close. They'll know soon whether they believe our warnings or not. Rylan's voice was grim. The high elves of Elderon were ancient, powerful, and shrouded in pride, as impenetrable as their forests. It had taken generations to mend the rifts between their races after Elderon's fall. Any appeal to an alliance against a threat they deemed myth would be met either with mockery or with demands for concessions their kingdom could no longer afford. "Is it too late?" Anya asked, the question hanging heavy in the stale air. "Is he already free?" Unlikely. The seers would have felt it. Rylan offered the reassurance with practised ease, but the lines around his eyes told another story. Anya ran her fingers over the last translated verses of the prophecy, "And the king shall rise from shadow-wrought tomb, the land itself, weeping his dark return." The seers, those blessed or cursed with visions, were silent. There were no prophecies of rising evils, no warnings. Elderon's return, it seemed, was her grim discovery alone. "The council must be told," she said, voice trembling as the weight of what she knew pressed down upon her. Rylan's expression was a mix of grim determination and a familiar hint of pity. "They won't listen to you, Anya. Not with this." He was right. She needed proof, something the council couldn't brush aside as the panicked ravings of an over-imaginative princess. Her eyes fell upon the ancient journal in her hand, the cryptic images and half-translated verses. "The key," she murmured. "It's the key to—" The answer hung on the tip of her tongue. The key to finding Elderon's prison. The key to knowing if he was truly breaking free. The key to perhaps even finding a way to reforge the wards before the world fell to ruin. The key to what, Princess? Ryland's voice held a note of exasperation. We need a plan of action, not more riddles. Anya closed the journal, tucking it into the folds of her scholar's robes. Elderon was not merely defeated. The ancients knew he could never be truly destroyed. They bound him, imprisoned him somewhere within our borders. This journal, the fragments I've pieced together, they lead to his tomb. The look on Ryland's face would have been comical in any other situation. It was a perfect reflection of the disbelief she faced at every turn. You want to go hunting for the tomb of a mythical evil, Princess? He asked incredulously. Not mythical, she insisted. Very real and very dangerous. Elderon's breaking free from his prison. The attacks, they're the proof. If we can find his tomb, we may find a way to stop him, or at the very least contain him once more. Or die trying, Ryland muttered. But beneath his gruff words his eyes narrowed in calculation. It was the look of a battle-hardened warrior forced to contemplate impossible odds. Very well, then. Where does this treasure hunt begin? The ancient capital, she said, her voice gaining strength now that the spark of a desperate plan was ignited. Thousands of years ago, empires spanned the breadth of the continent, and their mighty capital, Osteran, lay in ruins now, swallowed by the unforgiving wilds. The prophecy speaks of a hidden temple, a place they called the Vault of Starlight. It was where they performed the binding ritual. Her brother would never approve such a dangerous expedition. Her father would scoff at squandering resources based on her fancies. She and Ryland would have to disappear, to steal away before bureaucratic wheels ground into motion and trapped them. A fugitive princess and her loyal guardsmen. It was madness, but if she was right, it was their world's only hope. Ryland scrubbed a hand over his face. Ostaran is weeks away through treacherous territory, and even if we could find this temple... There'll be answers within, she insisted. Weapons they used against him, perhaps even the knowledge of how to renew the wards. We haven't the luxury of disbelief any more, Ryland. If I'm wrong, we lose a foolhardy princess. If I'm right... The alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. The preparations were hurried, fueled by urgency and the desperate need for secrecy. They could take only those sworn to absolute loyalty. Anya abandoned her fine silks and jewels for the worn leather and practical trousers of a scholar-turned-adventurer. Ryland bartered with a dubious merchant for supplies and scrounged for trustworthy guides, those with enough greed to override their fear of venturing into the ruins of cursed Osteran. Her heart hammered as they slipped unseen through the palace's hidden passages, the weight of what she'd set in motion heavy on her shoulders. Leaving a hastily scrawled note explaining, perhaps justifying, her flight sat like a lump of lead in her stomach. Keldrin would rage, her father would be heartbroken, the kingdom thrown into turmoil. Yet what choice did she have? They left under cover of darkness a small band of warriors and a princess on a collision course with either destiny or ruin. The journey was harsh, marked by chilling tales told around flickering campfires, stories of Ostaran whispered in hushed tones by hardened veterans, ruins haunted by shades of the past, cursed creatures lurking in the crumbling remnants of forgotten palaces. Anya forced down her rising panic, clinging to scraps of tattered maps, marking a perilous route to the heart of the ancient city. Doubt gnawed at her. Had she misread the crumbling texts? Were her deductions nothing more than the fevered imaginings of a desperate scholar? It was hubris to think history and a single princess could prevent a cataclysm. Her thoughts inevitably drifted to the journal secreted within her pack. On it was a crude sketch of a constellation, the Vault of Starlight's key. The image seemed to thrum with a faint power, promising answers, and perhaps a sliver of hope. Each day they drew closer to the desolate heart of the former empire. The wilds twisted and turned, as if the land itself resisted their approach. Unnatural storms erupted from cloudless skies. The very air vibrated with unease, pressing down on their small band. The warriors, once boisterous, now moved with grim-faced determination, weapons always close at hand. "We're being watched," Ryland murmured one evening as they made camp in the shadow of a toppled, moss-covered statue. The eyes of their guides gleamed with barely concealed terror. Anya nodded, her own unease a cold knot in her gut. The shadow beasts, perhaps, or something far worse, bound to their destination. The looming remnants of Osteran broke through the desolate landscape like the skeletal claws of a long-dead titan. Twisted towers clawed at the sky, their once magnificent carvings warped into grotesque mockeries of former glory. "Princess, if I may," Rylan hesitated. It was unnatural to witness the battle-hardened captain at a loss for words. "You think me mad, don't you?" Anya finished for him, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "Everyone will, once what we've done is discovered." "That's not—" He shook his head. "I believe you, Anya, more than you know. I saw the fear in those villagers' eyes, the wounds no beast of this world could inflict. You are the most brilliant person I know." His words held a strange vulnerability she'd never heard before. "But this—" He gestured towards the ruins, the decaying heart of an empire, now warped into a monstrous haven for the rising darkness. "The stories are true. This place is evil." They entered the shattered remnants of the city with dawn's first rays. It was a place of crushing silence, broken only by the mournful whispers of the wind through broken arches and the jarring caw of carrion crows circling overhead. Anya, with her journal open and faded map clutched in her other hand, led them through the maze of crumbling houses and palaces, laid low by time, and a power beyond mortal understanding. The constellation she'd painstakingly translated was their guiding star, each step matching its celestial path through the ruins. Yet the closer they drew, the heavier the air became, as if it actively resisted their progress. Finally they stood before a towering archway, its intricate carvings marred by blackened streaks, as if clawed by something monstrous. Beyond, a vast courtyard lay in shadowy ruin, yet untouched by the encroaching wild. At its centre was a dome impossibly intact amidst the devastation, the Vault of Starlight. "The maps lead us here," she said. "The key to Elderon's tomb should be within." Ryland's jaw clenched. "And whatever guards his prison, will those be inside as well?" A cold certainty settled upon Anya. "We won't truly know until we enter." They approached the dome, its smooth surface shimmering with a faint, ethereal light. Runes she recognized from her translations lined the sealed doorway, the starlight of the dome reflecting in their intricate patterns. With a shaking hand she pressed her palm against them, feeling a surge of power thrum beneath her touch. The runes flared to life, and with a groan echoing through the desolate courtyard, the immense doors began to part. And a cold blast of ancient air washed over them as the doors opened, revealing a chamber bathed in an unearthly luminescence. Starlight cascaded down the walls, as if reflected from 1,000 unseen stars, forming shimmering constellations on the dusty floor. Anya gasped, recognizing patterns she'd meticulously studied, now blazing before her. In the chamber's centre, a circular dais glowed with the same spectral light. Upon it rested a sarcophagus, massive, simple, and utterly devoid of inscription. Elderon's tomb was no monument to a king, but a stark, unadorned prison. "The warding sigil, they're intact," Ryland murmured, eyes fixed on the intricate runes encircling the sarcophagus. "He's still bound within." He sounded almost disappointed. A small, shameful part of Anya felt the same. If the wards were unbroken, she'd been wrong. Perhaps these were relics of a long-defeated foe, the prophecies corrupted by time and fear. Yet a dissonant hum resonated within the chamber, a note of wrongness beneath the ethereal glow. Instinctively, she knew the wards were not whole. Something had cracked, weakened, allowing a shadow of Elderon's monstrous power to seep into the world. "Look," one of the warriors pointed a trembling finger at a far corner of the chamber. Where there should have been only smooth, unbroken wall, a web of hair-thin cracks marred the surface, twisting and spreading like an unnatural infection. From those cracks seeped wisps of inky shadow that coiled and writhed against the ethereal starlight. Anya stumbled back, terror jolting through her. Those cracks shouldn't be there. The wards were failing. "Princess," Ryland began, reaching for her, but his voice was drowned out by an echoing crack, like the world itself tearing. One by one, the glowing sigils encircling the sarcophagus began to flicker and dim. The pulse of spectral light stuttered, casting the chamber into flickering darkness. From the sarcophagus came a rasping sound, like dry leaves scuttling against the unforgiving stone. With a final agonized groan, the remaining sigils sputtered out. The spectral light vanished, plunging them into a darkness so absolute it felt like a smothering weight. In the smothering blackness, a new light bloomed. A sickly crimson glow emanated from the sarcophagus, outlining its stark form in the oppressive gloom. Anya's stomach churned. This was not how it was meant to be. The rituals described in her book, the starlight, the sigils, were meant to hold the monstrous king fast. "Princess, behind you!" a warrior shouted. Anya whirled, terror propelling her back as an inhuman shriek tore through the darkness. From the cracks in the wall, the inky shadows had coalesced into monstrous forms. Shadow beasts, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger, surged towards them. Steel clashed on steel. Her warriors, battle-hardened and brave, met the onslaught with a roar. But these were no ordinary foes. Shadows clung to blades, biting through flesh with unnatural coldness. Cries of pain and fear echoed through the chamber. Her guides, the men who had risked their lives to lead her here, fell one by one, their screams cut short as the darkness devoured them. Rylan fought beside her, his sword not of steel but forged from pure sunlight, a relic of a forgotten age. It cut through the shadows, dispersing them in bursts of sizzling smoke, but for every foe banished, two more materialized. "Anya, run!" Rylan's shout was barely audible above the monstrous cacophony. But where could she run? The doors of the vault were lost in the impenetrable gloom. They were surrounded, trapped, doomed to be swallowed by a darkness of ancient making. With a grief-stricken cry, she watched as a beast leapt through the chaos, its claws sinking into Rylan's chest. Yet instead of tearing flesh, it seemed to drain him, his sun-forged sword clattering forgotten to the ground. He staggered, spectral light fading from his eyes in chilling unison with the sigils of the tomb. "No!" Anya cried, her fear a blazing fire within her. She tore at the pack around her and stumbled, scrabbling for the journal that had fallen in the melee. Her shaking fingers flipped desperately through the brittle pages until she found the passage she'd only half dared to believe in. An incantation, whispered in the tongue of the ancients, a last resort against the encroaching darkness. Desperate and cornered, she spoke the forgotten words, feeling a surge of power thrumming through her veins. The ancient words echoed through the chamber. They felt alien in her mouth, syllables infused with a power she'd never imagined wielding. The warriors locked in desperate combat hesitated, both human and monstrous, as the very air seemed to shiver in response to her incantation. From her upturned palm, a burst of golden light erupted, not the ethereal starlight of the vault, but something raw, untamed and blazing with the heat of an awakened sun. It slammed into the crimson glow emanating from the sarcophagus. For a single blinding moment, the darkness was banished. The shadow beasts recoiled, their forms flickering and dissolving under the onslaught of pure light. The sickening crimson glow shuddered, faltering against the unexpected force. Yet it did not vanish. With a deafening screech, something within the sarcophagus stirred, a rage made manifest, seeking to extinguish her defiant act. A wave of force, heavy as a collapsing mountain, struck Anya. The journal was torn from her hands, the incantation broken. She was hurled back, her vision filled with blinding flashes of crimson as she slammed into the unforgiving stone. Her ears rang, her breath knocked from her body. Through a haze of pain she heard a splintering crack, sickeningly wet, followed by a monstrous hiss that resonated within the very core of her being. The crimson glow flared blindingly bright. Then it began to recede, drawing back into the sarcophagus as if startled by her defiance. With it, the shadows flickered and vanished. The only sounds in the suffocating silence were ragged gasps as the survivors, battered but alive, staggered to their feet. Rylan lay still on the ground, his face etched with unnatural shadows. As the world swam back into focus, Anya scrambled to his side, her heart thundering like a battle drum against her ribs. Rylan! But even as the name left her lips, she knew. The shadows had taken something from him, a piece of his soul, leaving his body a cold, lightless husk. Waves of grief and despair threatened to drown her. She'd led them here. Her ambition, her conviction that she held the key to saving their world, had cost them everything. With trembling hands, Anya pressed Rylan's eyelids closed. There was no time for mourning. She scanned the chamber, the once luminous vault now steeped in inky blackness. The warriors milled about, their faces etched with grim determination and the lingering fear of what they'd just faced. They were wounded, leaderless, facing an ancient evil they barely comprehended. Yet even in the wake of such loss, their eyes flickered towards the sarcophagus, a grim sense of duty reflected in their hardened expressions. The silence in the tomb felt deafening, the echoes of that monstrous presence still vibrating in the air. Elderon, the tyrant king, stirred back into monstrous life by forces beyond their understanding. From the depths of his dark prison he'd reached out to lash at them. He was not free. Yet. Anya rose to her feet, swaying slightly, her voice a ragged whisper. We need to leave. She stumbled to the sarcophagus, its smooth surface pulsing with a malevolent chill that seeped into her very bones. Each step felt like wading through mud, the monstrous king within exerting its will, trying to snare her. Yet somewhere deep inside her a stubborn spark refused to extinguish. The sarcophagus was bound with chains, their once golden sheen twisted into something dark and malevolent. Upon those chains were inscribed the sigils of the ancient alliance, dwarven runes of unbreakable iron, elven script shimmering with starlight, and flowing human script etched in the blood of fallen heroes. These runes were corrupted, warped, and twisted into mockeries of their original meaning. Anya felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. The warding ritual had failed, yes, but it had not been broken entirely. If only she could find a way to decipher the corrupted runes, to reforge the chains, perhaps Elderon could be contained once more. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only hope left. She traced a trembling finger along the corrupted sigils, her mind racing. Knowledge was her weapon, the only tool she possessed against such an ancient evil. Closing her eyes, she pictured the journal's brittle pages in her mind, the painstakingly translated texts, the fragments of history, whispered warnings that now thundered in her soul. A plan began to form, hazy yet promising. With her scholar's mind and the remnants of this shattered ritual, perhaps there was still a chance, a way to fight back against the rising darkness. They left the vault, the monstrous presence of Elderon lingering like a poisonous fog in the wake of their retreat. Outside, the ruins of Osteran loomed, an endless stretch of shattered majesty and spectral warnings. The return journey was a blur of forced marches, grim determination overriding their grief and exhaustion. Anya retreated into herself, her mind a maelstrom of half-remembered verses, ancient sigils, and a desperate need to salvage meaning from the ruins of their expedition. They carried Ryland's body, a grim reminder of the cost of her choices. But to abandon him to the monstrous forces of Osteran, to the reach of the tyrant king, was unthinkable. With each passing league, her determination hardened into cold resolve. She would not allow their sacrifice to be in vain. News of the attack, mangled remains of their guides, and the chilling tale of shadows tearing through the ranks of the shadow beast hunters would reach the kingdom. They would scoff at her warnings, cite these losses as proof of her folly. She would force them to listen. She would arm herself with knowledge and with the stark, undeniable proof of Elderon's resurgence. The corrupted warding sigils, the remnants of the fallen shadow beasts, even Ryland's lifeless body. The shattered shards of their expedition would become the weapons with which she would rally her kingdom. They would mock her no longer. Her brother Seldrin would bluster and shout accusations of treason. Her father would grieve the daughter he thought he knew, a bookish dreamer lost to madness and warmongering. The council would see her as an upstart, her fear-mongering a threat to their power. The elves of Elderon, should she even manage to convince them of the rising danger, would scorn her, blame humanity's folly for the return of their shared ancient enemy. Yet she would persevere. She was no longer merely a princess, a scholar. She was the sole bearer of a terrible truth, and the world, however reluctantly, would be forced to heed her warnings. This was her burden, her terrible purpose, forged in the ruins of Osteran in the shadow of the forgotten king, and paid for in her dearest friend's life. Let them call her a fool, a warmonger, even a traitor. History, if they survived long enough to write it, would be her judge. Anya stood before the royal council, her head held high. Gone were the threadbare robes of a scholar, replaced by the sombre colours of one in mourning. Around her whispered her father, his voice choked with heartbroken disappointment, and courtiers, their eyes filled with a chilling mix of pity and scorn. Keldrin, her beloved brother, was a storm of barely contained fury, his usual bluster laced with an icy rage. He believed her treacherous, her actions a bid for power amidst chaos. She couldn't blame him. In a way she wished it were that simple, yet her voice rang out clear and strong. I have returned from Osteran. What I found there, it is the terrible confirmation of what I have long warned you. She gestured to where Ryland's body lay, shrouded in the tattered finery of a Kingsguard, the spectral shadows clinging to his lifeless form, a dark, undeniable testament. A wave of unease swept through the opulent council hall. Here, at least, the shadows couldn't reach them, could not silence her. One by one, she presented her grim collection of evidence, speaking of corrupted wards, shadow beast remains, and the lingering monstrous presence within Elderon's tomb. She spoke of the forgotten prophecies, the desperate ancient struggle against the monstrous king. At first there was disbelief, scorn, and thinly veiled accusations of madness. Yet, as she laid out her knowledge and deductions, the cold indifference began to crumble. Fear seeped into eyes accustomed to dismissing unpleasantries. The elven ambassador, summoned in haste, brought not the mockery Anya had prepared herself for, but grim tidings. Creatures of shadow, like those described, had begun to slip the boundaries of Elderon. Their seers, long silent on such matters, now whispered fearfully of a malevolent presence stirring within their world's ancient heartlands. The dwarven envoys were reluctant, but could not deny the craftsmanship of the corrupted chains, the chilling similarity to tales long dismissed as the drunken ramblings of mad miners who ventured too deep. Finally, she called upon the royal mages, her father's most trusted advisers. It was they who paled before the corrupted sigils, their trained minds comprehending the terrible potential, the sheer malevolent power that could twist and warp a binding ritual meant to contain such evil. The council chamber was no longer a realm of politics and power games. It was a war room, the enemy not an invading army at their gates, but a monstrous threat seeping through the cracks of their reality. Anya was no longer a scorned princess, but the sole beacon of knowledge in a darkening storm. The battle lines were drawn not by borders on a map, but between light and the encroaching shadows. They would stand, a desperate alliance of old rivals, bound by necessity. But it would be Anya's knowledge, bought with sacrifice, that would guide them. The war for their survival had begun,